Hello and welcome to this OECD webinar. I'm Duncan Crawford, a senior editor at the OECD, and today we're talking about PISA. For those who don't know, PISA stands for Programme for International Student Assessment. It is the global benchmark for assessing 15-year-olds in maths, reading and science. How are students performing overall around the globe? Well, you're going to have to wait and see. The big launch is still over a month away on December the 5th. 81 countries and economies have taken part in total. It is going to be the biggest PISA ever. For now, though, today, ahead of the launch, we will explore how PISA works, how its data is collected, and how that data is used by countries to create positive change. I'm joined by Andreas Schleiser, OECD's Director for Education and Skills, who's going to outline some of the key information about PISA and its purpose. Before we get into that, to those joining, please send in your questions for Andreas. If you use the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom feed, you can type in your questions and we will try to get through as many of them as possible. Good plan? I think so. Now though, without further ado, let's hand over to Andreas, who will give us some more details about this upcoming PISA report. Andreas, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Duncan. And just to repeat what Duncan has just said, if you expect to see results from PISA, you'll be disappointed. This webinar really is just about to introduce the ideas, the methods, and the processes behind PISA. And I'm going to share some slides with you to illustrate this. The first thing I want to say is that PISA is about 15-year-olds. The reason why we choose that age group is because it's an age at which schooling in most countries is still compulsory. So it gives us a flavor how well young people are prepared when they are about to enter the world of work or further education. So it's a cumulative yield of education that we're talking about here. The focus in PISA is on mathematics, on reading, on science, but it also looks at other aspects. Creative thinking was a new introduction in this edition of PISA. Prior to this, we looked at collaborative problem solving and global competency. So while mathematics, reading and science feature in every PISA assessment, other subjects come out occasionally. This is a map of the countries that took part in this latest edition of PISA, and we have some newcomers in as well. These are El Salvador, Jamaica, Mongolia, the Palestinian Authority, and Uzbekistan. The other systems that you can see here have done PISA before. But it's a growing group of countries that are interested in seeing where the education systems fare on a global scale, the premier metric for measuring educational success, which is what PISA aims to be and is. The results will be released on the 5th of December 23 this year, and they will consist of 2 volumes. Volume 1 will look at the state of learning, but also the extent to which education systems offer a level playing field, where educational success does not depend, or the extent to which educational success depends on social background. There will be a volume 2 that looks particularly at the experience of students during the pandemic. The last time we did PISA was in 2018. Before the pandemic, 2022 was right after the pandemic. So this gives us a nice way to see what's different after and before the pandemic in terms of the setup of education systems and in terms of the learning outcomes, in terms of student engagement, the quality of social relationship. Lots of really interesting data being collected that allow us to see how education made it through the pandemic in different parts of the world. And we are particularly interested in which education systems proved to be resilient to the disruptions which the pandemic provided. So which made it in terms of, maintaining at least or even improving mathematics performance. We look at to what extent education systems succeeded on moderating the impact of social background on student success. Some people say, well, the pandemic has hurted those from more disadvantaged backgrounds most. Students from wealthy backgrounds probably always had opportunities to find their way around closed school doors, not getting alternative offers for education. students from disadvantaged backgrounds often remained, locked out when schools closed down. To what extent has that, borne out by the data? How has this played out in different parts of the world, in different education systems? I think it's a really interesting question as well that PISA looks at. And then last but not least, education is not just about academic success. We put a lot of emphasis on the well-being of students, particularly on their sense of belonging in school. And to what extent has that changed during the pandemic? And again, what are the factors that are associated with this? And that brings me to the next slide. We look at what systemic individual school factors relate to resilience. Now we look at the learning experiences that students had during school closures, digital alternatives, remote learning, tutoring, whatever happened. We looked at school life and home support, to what extent were parents engaged, how did they relate to the education of their children. We look at students' pathways through schools, to what extent do education systems provide a more structured offer where students are given specific alternatives, or a more open environment where students have to make choices. We look at the material and resources, and to what extent are outcomes aligned with needs, to what extent are resources aligned with needs. And we look at issues around governance. Very interesting question. To what extent do teachers, do schools have a say in decisions that are being made or are held accountable for the consequences of their actions? So those are characteristics that we are studying in the second volume to understand what made systems more or less resilient. Now, this is not the end of the story, actually. This is just the beginning of the release of PISA results. More is going to come in 24. We will have a very interesting volume on creative thinking. This is the very first time any international assessment has ventured to look not just at, static student knowledge and competencies, but their, creative ways of producing answers and responses. We'll have a volume on financial literacy. This is something that PISA has done before, not in every cycle, but occasionally. And we look at students' readiness for lifelong learning. To what extent have students acquired the dispositions, the motivation, the learning strategies they need to become really effective learners for life? So more to come in 24. Let me just highlight this edition is focused on mathematics. That was the centerpiece of the 22 PISA assessment. PISA has always, featured one domain with special emphasis to give countries an in-depth picture. And this edition focuses on mathematics. And I want to give you the definition that we use for mathematics, because it's actually somewhat different than what you're used in school mathematics. Now, in school mathematics, you often talk about geometry, algebra, specific content knowledge. And of course, content knowledge plays into PISA. Students need to know a lot of mathematical content to be able to solve the PISA task. But we were also very interested in their capacity to reason mathematically. Not just, what do you know in mathematics, but can you think like a mathematician? Can you take a real world problem, translate it into the world of mathematics? First of all, understand that the problem that you see in front of you can be solved with mathematical tools. That's often the very first step where students have sometimes difficulties now. Then, can you, in the world of mathematics, find the right mathematical tools to solve that problem? And then finally, when you've solved the mathematical problem, can you translate that problem back into the real world to understand its meaning, its implications? So this includes concepts, procedures, facts, tools. So describe phenomena that you observe. Now, how can you actually describe a real-world phenomena in mathematical terms? Can you explain it? Can you use mathematics to assess the consequences, make predictions? No? So that's the idea of mathematics in PISA. It's a very kind of looks at the thinking process involved. And I can show you a little bit of the framework that is underpinning this. First of all, we ask students to formulate, situations in mathematical terms. Then to use those mathematical terms and concepts. And then finally, interpret the outcomes. Now, that's basically the framework that is underpinning it. We have
a number of big contexts underpinning this. We look at quantity. Can students think quantitatively? Can they deal with probabilities, uncertainty, and data? Very, very important concept these days. Most of the phenomena in this real world are probabilistic by nature. To what extent can students, understand, deal with uncertainty? Change in relationship. Very important mathematical part of mathematics. Can you understand those kinds of concepts? And then space and shape. Geometry is part of that, but not all of that. What we are also looking at as to what extent students master specific 21st century skills that are important. Critical thinking, very important in mathematics. Creativity. Some people would say, well, mathematics is the antithesis to creativity. It's, just reproducing mathematical content. But this is a very bad notion of mathematics. Mathematics actually is a creative subject. You need to have ideas. You need to understand mathematical ideas, employ them creatively to solve complex problems. Research and inquiry, not about reproducing mathematical knowledge, but, questioning some of those ideas. Self-direction, initiative, persistence, that's certainly something that you need. Information use, systems thinking, communication, reflection on problem solutions, and so on. And we give students tasks that come from a variety of contexts, from their very personal world, from the world of work, from society, and the scientific context as well. This idea, again, behind it is mathematical reasoning. This also featured in previous PISA assessments. I should say that, this is not a totally new aspect, but for the first time we have, separated out. There's going to be a separate measurement on mathematical reasoning that involves evaluation of situations, selecting mathematical approaches, strategies, drawing mathematical conclusions, developing and describing your solutions, analyzing them, and then, studying how those solutions can actually be used, applied in the real world. Well, I wanted to introduce one more feature that is new in this edition of PISA, and that is a broader range of outcomes that we will be summarizing in PISA Happy Life Index. It's not much of this data has also been collected in the past in PISA, but we believe that after the pandemic, it is important to look not just at academic outcomes, but a broader range of important student outcomes that PISA captures. Of course, there is academic performance. I already talked about that. What do students know, what they can do in the 3 subject areas? But there's also psychological well-being, the extent to which students experience positive emotions. Are they satisfied with their life? Do they believe their life has meaning and purpose? Aspects that probably also the result of a good education. Very important, agency and engagement. To what extent are students not just passive consumers of prefabricated content, but develop agency, can mobilize their cognitive, social, emotional resources to do something. Very important aspect of PISA, growth mindset. We studied that in the last PISA assessment. It features more prominently in that concept of agency engagement as well. We look at student resilience. Students believe in their ability to get around stressful, difficult situations. To what extent are they confident in themselves? To what extent are they confident in their autonomy as learners? We look at students' engagement with school. To what extent do they value their time at school? To what extent do they study hard, put effort in their studies? And to what extent do they contribute to a productive, positive disciplinary climate in school? So that's also an important outcome that we look at. We study the quality of relationships, community vitality. That captures both the quantity but also the quality of students' relationships. It looks at the extent to which students feel accepted and appreciated by their peers, and whether they perceive support and care from their parents, from their teachers, and all aspects that we looked at coming into this. Then, quite interesting in an international comparative perspective, to what extent do students put their time in studying as opposed to leisure? We know that the school length varies a lot across countries, so does homework, all of those things. So how does this play out What are the effects? We look at the material and the cultural well-being of young people. And last but not least, their openness to diversity. To what extent do they appreciate different ways of thinking, different ways of working? How open are they to people from different backgrounds, different cultures, and so on? So dimensions, not all of them are new to PISA, but for the first time, we're going to kind of put them all together and put them on par with academic performance to give, countries a really good picture of a more holistic set of learning outcomes. So that's going to be another interesting feature. The last point I want to make is that this is a sort of special edition. It is very clear that it was tough to conduct PISA in the year immediately after the pandemic. To some extent, schools were still closed or just reopening. They had logistical difficulties. Now, some schools might have also said, look, after the pandemic, we have other things on our mind. It was sometimes harder to recruit schools, to get them to participate, and so on. And in most countries, it worked really well. And I must commend the countries that did a tremendous job of conducting PISA, this very complex survey, under these difficult conditions. But there will be some countries where we will have to provide some annotation where, they may not have reached the full set of responses. Not all schools might have participated, and so on. We asked those countries to study to what extent those, diversions from the very strict PISA technical standards might have had implications on results. And there is a small group of countries where you can say, yeah, probably there was a little distortion in the results, and we annotate them, and that's a group of 5 countries in that category. And then there was another group of countries that did not meet one or more of the PISA sampling standards. Again, usually this is about not finding enough schools to respond, and we don't have good enough data to actually know for sure to what extent there is some potential bias in the results, and these include Hong Kong, Jamaica, Latvia, and 5 other countries. So there are eight education systems in that situation where we have to flag results. We still publish all of these results because we're quite confident that roughly they are comparable, but readers should just know there's a little caveat. We need to look at some of those implications of those kinds of distortion. So that was really all I wanted to say about PISA 22. I want to go back to the past and give you a flavor of what PISA has actually done in countries. I think that's a question we all have. To what extent do those results actually lead to changes, to improvements in education? And there are various ways in which PISA has played out in this sense. I just want to give you a sort of short flavor of this. The first that PISA always offers is to just see what is possible in education. Sometimes, we think, well, we have struggled really hard. We don't see much improvement, or we see a little bit of improvement. Can we do better? And, you look outside of your window, you look to the next school, you look to the next country, and sometimes schools under similar conditions do achieve a lot better results. In one of in the 2012 PISA assessment, we had the region of Shanghai in China participating in PISA, and it was the top performer. And the British Minister of Schools in those days said, well, I want to study what they did. I want to learn from them. And she used to be a mathematics teacher herself. She was really, really interested in this. So she went to Shanghai. And actually, she was very impressed, because people had told her, oh, this is just because there's a lot of pressure on those kids. They have to study hard, but it's all about rote learning. And when she went to classrooms in Shanghai, she found, no, they were actually using really interesting pedagogies. And they're very, very strong in teaching students mathematical ideas, mathematical concepts. So she invited teachers from Shanghai in China to actually come to Britain, and there have been lots of teaching exchanges. There was lots of exchanges of curriculum material. And that's really a good example. We can see actually many of those examples across the world where people have looked outwards, seen what's happening around the world, and you can never copy and paste those experiences. But the first thing you can see is simply what is possible, what I can learn, what I can translate into my own context. You can place national standards into a broader perspective. Brazil was the first country beyond the OECD membership that applied for PISA in the first PISA cycle. And when I received a call from the presidential office in those days in Brazil, and they asked for this, I was actually very surprised. I asked them, oh, that's really interesting. Of course, you can participate, but why would you do that? You're still a country in much lower state of economic development, and probably your results won't be that great. And what they told me is, well, we're not stupid. We do understand where we will come out, but our problem is a different one. In our country, everybody thinks education is great, because, the parents think, well, the schools of my children are so much better than the schools I went to. And this is so much improved. And everybody gets good marks, good results on national exams. And we do not see, what's really good when looked at in an international perspective. And don't be surprised that, Brazil came out pretty much at the bottom of the first PISA assessment. And then they anchored their national assessment against PISA standards so that they could actually locate schools, states, and the country in a broader national context. And that sparked an enormous, powerful debate in the country. And actually, in the years following the PISA release, Brazil was able to double investment in school education, really sort of making a lot more of an effort. And interestingly, in the years that followed, the results of Brazil actually improved quite markedly. Brazil got a lot more young people in education and at the same time improving their results. So simply, contextualizing national performance in a broader perspective can be one of those ways. No? Great inflation. Sometimes you see students do better and better and better and better on national standards, national exams, and on PISA, actually, you don't see much improvement. No? And that really suggests that maybe it's not the performance that improves, but that the standards get deflated. And that's really something that you can see. It's very hard to see with national instruments alone, but it's something that you can see when you compare improvement on national standards and improvement on international standards. Contextualizing curricular choices. Some countries see, well, I didn't do that well in mathematics. Why? Because my students, the students in my country, do not learn some things that are very important in other countries. These days, for example, some countries have embarked on, computational thinking. Other countries did not. Well, it features in the PISA assessment. So probably you're going to see countries that have not yet introduced those aspects, computational thinking or probabilistic thinking. They're going to see that in their results, and they can ask themselves the question, maybe we should introduce the subject, or they say, no, this is not relevant for us. But it allows you to look at what you teach, the content that is being covered in the context of what is being covered in other countries. And we have plenty of really interesting examples of this. In fact, in that sense, PISA has stimulated a lot of curricular comparisons. Countries are now looking much more actively on what others teach and why. You can lower the political cost of action. Japan was one of the countries that did really well on the first PISA assessment. But, the Japanese were not happy with this, because when they looked at the results in more detail, they saw, well, our students are actually very good on multiple choice questions where they just have to reproduce answers. But our students really struggle when they have to answer open-ended tasks. That's really, really hard for our students, and we would like to introduce them. But, in Japan, many people say, don't touch the education system. It's working well, it's delivering good results, don't change it. Well, what the Japanese could tell to their population is, well, in other countries, students do better on those kinds of tasks, and they teach those kinds of tasks. So it made it easier for policymakers actually to introduce those changes, because they could show actually where this is done with what success. And at the same time, PISA does not only lower the political cost of action, making it easier for policy to do certain changes, to introduce certain changes, but can also be used to raise the political cost of inaction. My country, Germany, is a great example. In 2000, the education system was pretty complacent. Now, everybody thought, well, education is great. Everybody goes to school. We have a long tradition of education, a well-working economy, so everything seems to be working well. Well, then came the PISA results and showed, well, the results are good for some, but not for everyone. There were large social disparities in outcomes. And overall, the outcomes were not as great as people thought. And that put a lot of pressure on the education systems to improve. Germany introduced national standards. It introduced a much greater support for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, including immigrant students. It strengthened significantly early childhood education and care. So this was done because PISA put a certain degree of pressure on the system to improve. And last but not least, you can generate interesting hypotheses. No? What makes education systems succeed? What underpins education systems that do well or that have seen rapid improvement? It's not always possible to validate those hypotheses because PISA does not allow to answer, cause and effect question. It's just a snapshot, a cross-sectional survey, not a longitudinal study, a truly longitudinal study. But you can build hypotheses and then combine PISA with other methods to study that. That's just to give you a flavor of what to expect.
Thank you so much for that, Andreas. Really interesting. All of that absolutely packed full of information, and we've had loads of comments already coming in on the chat and lots of people saying hello as well. So hello to Amanda in Scotland, Radita in Romania, Jacqueline in Scotland. We've got people writing in from Malta, Philippines, Brazil, India, US, Spain, Poland. I could go on. So it truly is an international event, this webinar, with a truly international audience and lots of interest in all things PISA. So to get things going, Andreas, I'd like to give you a bit more of a break after that long presentation, but if you've had at least a few seconds to have a breather, here is a first question for you. How does the OECD ensure that the PISA tests remain confidential and secure? I mean, it's a huge operation, obviously, involving many hundreds, if not thousands of people across dozens and dozens of countries and economies. So how do you keep the information secure?
Well, the first is we do not publish the items in any form after the assessment. We publish a small set of tasks that are not going to be reused, but by keeping the items confidential, that's the first step. Then we have very elaborate security procedures in the assessment. Basically, each and every of the tasks follow a strict protocol with signed confidentiality statements. They're only given to test administrators right before the assessment. So there's quite elaborate procedures in place to ensure the confidentiality of the assessment. But afterwards, we have many ways to check for that, actually. When we actually get the results, we study very carefully to what extent there are patterns in the results that suggest that, students have been given, some clues or had, some special training. You can look at whether tasks function very differently in one country from others. So there are many ways how we can actually not only keep the item secure, but also assess to what extent security has been adhered to in different countries.
And to those who don't know, how does PISA measure the performance of education systems?
Yeah, PISA is basically an internationally agreed test, a standardized test that is given to all students in the same way. We look at basically the quality of learning outcomes. To what extent have students mastered what countries collectively believe is important? The whole process starts with actually, and this is the most difficult part, countries agreeing on a framework. When we talk about mathematics, what kind of mathematics is most important? What do we want students to be able to do? Now, that's what I try to introduce at the beginning, the kind of ideas and frameworks. Then countries work together to build that test. And that's another elaborate process because we need to ensure that that assessment works across countries, that it works across languages, that it works across cultures. So there is a significant effort going into adapting, localizing the assessment, making sure that it remains standardized, that the task have the same, focus on the same cognitive abilities, but at the same time also reflect the cultural and context in which students learn and schools operate. And then last but not least, the test is adaptive to the extent that actually students get different packages of the test depending on their ability, because it's digitally delivered. We are able to actually do that. So it's a quite elaborate and complex process, but it's basically an assessment where students have to show that what they know, what they can do with what they know, and also their attitudes towards learning.
Great, thank you so much for that. Here's a question for you from Van Davy, who writes that around the 2005 PISA report, there was a data set that showed 61% of students were bored at school, despite 90% of them being happy with their teachers. And he goes on to say that the OECD has not asked this kind of bracket of questions since, he believes. Is there a reason for that, he asks?
Well, actually, we have much further elaborated those kinds of questions. Now, simply to see to what extent students are interested and bored doesn't give us many clues on what to improve. But in the latest PISA, we look in much greater detail to what extent, do field students, interested and engaged? To what extent do they believe school prepares them well for life? To what extent they believe, school has taught me things that are meaningful for me? We look at the quality of student-teacher relationship. To what extent do students feel that their teacher understands who they are, who they want to become, accompanies them? So we have not asked that same question, but further refined that question to give a much more detailed understanding on the extent to which there is a good match between what young people at age 15 expect and how well the system serves those expectations.
Another question for you here from Noah Hudson, who wants to know if PISA 2022 uses the same well-being, life satisfaction and belonging measurements that we used back in 2018, and whether or not it's going to analyze the relationship between well-being and attainment.
Yeah, absolutely. These two questions remain the same, but we have also introduced many more dimensions. The index that I showed at the end encompasses now 8 different aspects, of which life satisfaction and student sense of belonging, well-being are a part of. So yes, we can observe how those specific features have changed, but I do believe we have a much more interesting and complete picture of students' well-being and sense of belonging now.
Thank you for that, Andreas. Plenty more questions coming in for you as we speak. Here's another one for you from Kasia Jasanuska, who wants to know if it's actually possible to combine the scores from science, maths and reading that students or countries get in PISA to get one score, overall score per student. And if so, would you recommend any resource that could help with that?
It's a very interesting question. We have asked ourselves that many times. Technically, that's quite easy to do. The simplest way would be to build an average of those 3 scores. It gives you a sense of overall outcomes. And many people would do that. And personally, I must say I have a lot of sympathy with this. But educators are quite reluctant to do those kinds of things. So the countries that govern PISA have shied away from that. They understand the value of having a single metric, but they also say, well, mathematics and reading are really very, very different concepts. And we want to see how students, do relatively on those. But, I would not see any problem with anyone who says, well, I'll pick the average and get an overall measure on education performance. I do think technically there's nothing that speaks against it. We do that all the day, with all sorts of indices that we construct every day. So I think it's technically possible, but the members of PISA have chosen not to do that in our international reports.
Thank you for that. And Cassia, who asked that question, she's writing an economics dissertation based on PISA in Poland. So hopefully that will help you with your dissertation. Moving on to another question. How does the OECD involve participating countries and economies in the interpretation and the analysis of the data that is collected?
Yeah, in fact, that is a very intensive the process. We start very, very early, several years before the results come out, and working with countries on the questions that PISA is meant to answer. And actually, those questions get raised before we even collect the data, because they shape the questionnaires that we give to students, to teachers, to parents, to school leaders. So that's the starting point, where countries, through the governing board and a questionnaire expert group, actually elaborate on the ideas, the questions that they want to ask for PISA. Then when the data are there, we have 3 processes. One is the development of the international reports, where we work with countries on an outline. The PISA governing board, that is basically the group that represents the member countries, is establishing, again, how should the results be reported. And that question, for example, should we just combine the
there's 3 subjects, or should we report them separately? This is a typical question that gets answered by that group of participating countries. So they work on the outline, they review the drafts of the reports, they make comments, they provide national examples, and then at the end, we have an international report. But that's not the end of the story. Each country also prepares its own national analysis, some countries in very elaborate ways, some countries, in a more kind of profiling way, and countries collaborate on this as well. In fact, just these days, I'm at the meeting of the PISA governing board, where we heard from many countries about their national analysis plan and their national reports and their national dissemination activities. It's not just the international report. These national reports serve a very, very important function in the dissemination of the PISA results. And then we have an international database that we release to encourage researchers around the world actually to make good use of the PISA results. I also forgot, we actually had a fair number of countries this year coming to the OECD in Paris to actually write their national reports together. I thought that was a really interesting process. Not, everybody sitting in their own room in their own country, but actually a group of countries coming together said, we are all struggling with the same question: how to interpret our results, how to communicate them. Why don't we do that together and build that process collectively? So that was a really interesting experience of a number of countries this year.
Thank you for that, Andreas. A question from Taro Kawahara, who I think wants clarification about the situation regarding the pandemic and how PISA obviously took place a year later than usual. It was originally scheduled for 2021. It was moved back a year because of the pandemic, because of school closures and what have you. And Taro writes that many countries and partner countries are likely to be judged not to be internationally comparable, or asks, is that a possibility? And says that the implementation rates of schools and students in each country are potentially lower than the technical standard, or are there going to be remedial measures put in place that correct the implementation rates of schools and students?
Well, if we had done the assessment in 21, probably this would have been a really big problem. But in 22, we were very fortunate that virtually all of the countries were able to meet the PISA technical standards. The ones that did not are listed. I showed them on the slide. There was a group of 5 countries that had data to suggest that there might have been some distortions, precisely because not all schools participated. And then there's a second group of 8 countries where we do not have good enough data to make the judgments, but where we know that school participation was not according to the technical standards. But it's a relatively small number of countries. In most countries, we are 100% confident that we can actually make good judgments on the basis of this data. And even on these 12 countries, I think the distortions are unlikely to be such that you cannot, make comparisons.
Thank you for that clarification. And thank you to everyone who is sending in their questions. Please continue to do so. And a few people have asked about the slides which were presented earlier on. You will be able to find those slides on the OECD's education webinar website. If you put into a search engine OECD Edu webinars, you'll be able to find that, and just click on this webinar, which will be up there, and you'll be able to find the link. Another question for you now, Andreas, from Matthew Gillespie from Teach for All, who says he's really interested in the Happy Life Index and the mixture of traditional indicators and those such as agency, leadership, community, and vitality. And he wonders if you could speak to how these newer indicators were assessed during the PISA fieldwork.
Yeah, they were basically constructed as part of the student assessment, the student questionnaire. And then we have a methodology to aggregate the responses from the student questionnaire to those indices. Like, for example, when we measure student sense of belonging, we ask students questions like, is it easy for you to find friends at your school? Do you feel that, school is a place where you like to be, where you're happy, and so on. So we ask students a battery of questions, and then there's a methodology to create an index, sense of belonging. And the same is true for all of those other dimensions. And the Happy Life Index basically then brings all of that together.
slightly related to the Happy Life Index, certainly to the motivation of students anyway. Jonathan Mifsud asked an interesting question. He asked, how can we foster motivation among students to excel in the PISA assessment, especially if they're unaware of their own individual performance afterwards? How do you make sure that kids are motivated to do the PISA test so they actually are performing to the best of their ability, basically?
Yeah, I think if students are only motivated by tests, that's probably not a great plan, because success in life is without tests. And in a way, I think the bigger question is, to what extent can we foster a more intrinsic interest and engagement and motivation? To what extent can students build effective learning strategies? And those are issues that PISA really looks at. What can schools do to create learning environments in which students deploy themselves, get engaged, without necessarily just looking towards the end of the year test. And so PISA is deliberately a low stakes test. We do not want to know how well can students perform under maximum pressure when the results count for life. No, we're not interested so much in this. What we're interested in is, how well do students perform in a normal situation? Because that's what you're going to face every day in life. In life, you're not always under high pressure, but we're very much interested in that kind of performance under realistic circumstances. So intentionally designed as a low stakes test, but actually PISA then asks students to what extent they took this test serious, to what extent they applied their best. So we actually have answers to that question through the PISA questionnaire. And they're quite interesting, actually. You can actually see that, yes, those answers often differ across students, across countries, even to some extent. And that of course needs to be taken into account when looking at the results. But once again, we want this to be a low stakes test.
And I've actually lost the question in the chat, but someone was asking where they can find this PISA data, if it was available in their country. And yes, you can go to the OECD website, look up PISA, and you'll be able to find all the latest PISA data on the website and analyze until your heart's content. Another question for you now, Andreas. Do you see teachers in schools and universities changing their teaching practices in any way as a result of PISA results?
Well, PISA probably doesn't influence the work of teachers directly. What it does, it often influences curriculum design and implementation. I can give you an example. In the year 2000, when PISA was first conducted, most curricula, the learning programs for students, were content-based. Students were taught a specific kind of mathematical, scientific content. Well, PISA introduced that notion of competence. To what extent can you use what you know? To what extent can you extrapolate from what you know, apply your knowledge in novel situations? Because, in the world in which we live, the world no longer rewards you just for what you know. Now, Google knows everything. The world rewards increasingly for what you can do with what you know. So we introduced that notion back in 2000. And actually many countries took that to heart and changed their curricula to create more kind of open-ended learning environments where students needed to produce answers rather than just to reproduce knowledge and so on. And that, of course, then trickled down to educational practice in the classroom. So PISA speaks largely to the educational systems. I can imagine that there were some teachers who looked at the results and said, oh, this is really interesting. I want to learn from my colleagues. Take again the example I mentioned in Britain, where Chinese teacher came to the UK and vice versa, and they collaborated. They learned from and with each other. So there were examples like this, but the big, delivery chain really from PISA is through the system.
Thank you for that, Andreas. And another question for you now from Roman Fawazani, who wants to know if you can elaborate a bit more on what you were talking about earlier on as to why PISA data is not optimal for inferring cause and effect type of relationships. Many readers often interpret, for example, groups mean difference, such as the effect of those groups, etc. Apologies, I can't actually understand the end of that question, but if you can elaborate on why PISA data cannot infer cause and effect type relationships.
Yeah, if you want to study cause and effect, you really have to do an experiment. You have to, have two groups of students randomly chosen, one where you introduce a certain treatment, a new variable, the other where you don't, and then at the end you compare the results. You track those kinds of students. That's not what PISA can do. Basically, PISA is just a cross-sectional photograph of the situation today. And then you can build hypotheses. You can see, for example, student success in one system depends very closely on social background. You can see actually the earlier education systems track students in different groups, the stronger that impact. And you can build that hypothesis as well. Maybe it has something to do with this, but you couldn't prove it. That's really the point, that you can build lots of interesting hypotheses with a high degree of plausibility, but you can never prove cause and effect. That's why it is very important to combine PISA with other types of methods to validate those hypotheses in ways that are scientifically legitimate.
Thanks for that, Andreas. And a question for you now about the scale of PISA. The upcoming PISA report has 81 countries and economies taking part, so it's larger in scale than ever before. But a question from Marguerite Clark in Washington, D.C., who says she thinks many countries want to participate in PISA but are concerned that their student performance is too low to be picked up on the PISA scale. She asks, is it possible for PISA to develop a test that can pick up on a fuller range of achievement? What are the pros and cons of doing this?
Well, actually, to some extent, that is what PISA has done over the last years. We actually had an exercise jointly with the World Bank and others to extend the PISA test for countries that had lower performing students, and we introduced that module into the general PISA test. So when I say that PISA is adaptive, the way that works is if you're in a low performing country or a low performing student, you actually get a set of tasks that are easier to solve. So to some extent, the PISA scale is capturing a quite wide range of performance, and we do not have flooring effects in this latest edition of PISA. We do not have countries that cannot be reliably capture the student performance. So I actually think PISA has done a lot to actually capture a wide range. I should also say that the variation that we see within countries is often much, much larger than the variation that we observe between countries. So you have many students in many countries that perform very, very poorly, and we have to measure the performance accurately. So it's not so much a challenge anymore to capture the whole range of the performance spectrum. So I think that's quite well done. The bigger challenge is that some of the concepts that PISA tries to measure actually require a fair level of baseline performance. And that's where things get difficult. For example, when we look at mathematical reasoning. To reason mathematically, you have to actually have a pretty good kind of a mathematical foundation. Or, we want to see to what extent can students use reading for learning. Now, deploy reading, reflect, critique, analyze, compare, distinguish fact from opinion. Now, to do that, you have to have a really strong baseline performance in reading. That's the bigger challenge, that some of those things cannot be done as well for countries that struggle with the basics. But when it comes to putting countries on the overall scale, I do believe every country that participated in this PISA assessment is getting really a very good and reliable assessment of their students.
Thank you for that, Andreas. You were talking about variation of within countries or between countries there. Here's another question about the variation between countries. You mentioned you were at the PISA governing board meeting today, no doubt meeting lots of delegations, someone writes. What did policymakers tell you, Andreas, where they see the unique value in taking part in PISA? Does it depend country by country? And where do you see PISA's place in the future, the questioner asks?
It's a very interesting question, and I think there are several answers to this. The most obvious value is you get comparative data. You can see actually how your country is performing. What are the strengths and what are the weaknesses when you look at this through the lens of an international comparison. And that's clearly a big motivation for a growing number of countries who want to be part of this. But that's not everything. Actually, many countries would tell you, well, I'm suddenly part of a fantastic international network. I work together with the best expertise in mathematics, in science, in reading, in social emotional development of students. And I'm part of the structure. I'm part of the development process. And I think that's something that we shouldn't underestimate. Many countries tell us this, that actually the real value for PISA is to become part of these global networks and to learn how to do this. And third, and that's particularly true for countries who do this the first time or the second time, some of them do not have a very good national assessment infrastructure in place, and PISA helps them build the kind of institutions, methodologies that then they also use at the national level. So I would be like, those three factors are really at the heart of the reason why a growing number of countries wants to be part of this.
Thanks for that, Andreas. Just to let everyone know, we've only got about 10 minutes or so left. We have still got quite a few questions to get through. If I do not get through all the questions, apologies, but we'll try to get through as many as possible. Here is another one for you, Andreas, from Laura Hernandez, who asks if there will be more variables like in previous editions to analyze the relationship between the scores and the use of ICT devices in and out of schools in this edition of PISA coming up.
Absolutely. And it's not just more, but it's also changes. Like we give much greater emphasis to mobile devices. We look at both devices that are used for learning and what we see in terms of their impact on outcomes or the relationship with outcomes, and devices for leisure. And actually that distinction is looked at in quite some detail in the report, because it's a very, very interesting kind of question. That schools sometimes have very different policies. Some schools might have a very proactive approach to integrating technology and instruction, and at the same time a very restrictive approach to allowing students to bring smartphones to the school. And those are questions that actually this edition of PISA looks at in much greater detail than the previous one. One reason for that is the pandemic. Schools have woken up to the digital world during the pandemic, and that's something that we try to reflect in our analysis.
Another question here about the data for you, Andreas, which I know you've already talked about to a certain extent, but the questioner asks, what are some of the potential pitfalls or misinterpretations of PISA data? And the questioner asks, how can we avoid these when using the data for educational reform?
Yeah, what is sometimes forgotten is that PISA only looks at selected outcomes. And as long as you're aware of this, we are looking at reading, at mathematics, at science, at problem solving, creative thinking, but we do not look at other outcomes that are also valued. Now, as long as you're aware of this, I don't think you make a mistake. But sometimes we forget that there are many important aspects in life and education that are not captured by PISA, and then we do not, take account of this in the interpretation. I think that's a big pitfall. Another one is that we draw causal inferences where they are not warranted. We see a correlation between certain variables and the outcomes, and we think, well, that's the cause for those. And those are big pitfalls in the international reports. We try to avoid them. We also work very, very closely with countries to ensure that in the national reports, we are true to the ideas of PISA and aware of the limitations.
Thank you for that, Andreas. Okay, and a few more questions to go. This one is about talent shortages. James Michael Walker writes that currently the whole world is facing significant talent shortages, and he's asking about how PISA can help fix this shortage, whether or not PISA can help fix the STEM, ICT, analytics, competencies deficit. Is there any role for PISA in regards to this or not, Andreas?
Well, and the purpose of PISA is to improve education, and more people know and can do, and the more our education systems deliver better results, the more likely we are going to address skills shortages. So I do think PISA is a very important tool to improve the quality of education, but it's a tool that works in the long run. It's about the 15-year-olds in school, and the skill shortages are often what we experience in today's labor force. So there is a challenge that is much bigger here.
And Neha Kapalesh Walker has a question for you as well. This is actually specific to your presentation, actually. It's a question about the example of Brazil you gave during your presentation, where you mentioned that you'd caution them against not taking part in the tests, Neha writes. Would you say that the tests are geared towards only certain countries or not?
Well, when PISA this was about the year 2000, when we had the very first edition of PISA, and I should say at that time, PISA was very much geared towards the countries that developed it. And for Brazil, it was a stretch, the PISA assessment. I think the question that we heard from Margarita earlier was quite legitimate in those days. We did not have that much resolution for the low performers. But that has changed a lot. PISA has really become a global enterprise. It has moved from, there's actually the majority of participants are not members of the OECD that hosts that assessment. They're actually from all over the world, and they're all collaborating together. So I do believe we have now a broad enough range of countries participating that we can ensure global relevance and of the metrics and of the assessment. So I think that is no longer a big concern. Like when you look at the results for Brazil, you can see that actually the test almost perfectly matches the ability distribution in Brazil, which I don't think we could say in the year 2000. So today, I wouldn't see any technical reason why a country could not join the PISA assessment. I think any country joining would get, a good picture of the performance of their students.
Thanks for that. And a question relating to actually a different OECD Education Directorate subject area. It's about TALIS, a different project area, I should say. Ramona Sararu asked, how does the OECD see the link between the current PISA results and TALIS 2018? And does the OECD plan to conduct another TALIS?
Yeah, absolutely. TALIS is a very important survey because it looks at the supply of education. It looks at the teaching force. And we all know that the quality of outcomes as measured by PISA can never exceed the quality of teachers. So studying the teaching force, studying their working methods, studying their pedagogies, studying the work environment, the work organization, as a support mechanism, the professional development will remain an important task. We will have another round just next year in 24, actually, of TALIS going into the field. And we always look at TALIS and PISA in conjunction. TALIS really provides the broader context, or some broader context, for the PISA results. PISA also has its own teacher questionnaire. There's a lot of questions that PISA asks teachers that are more specific to the outcomes that are being measured. But absolutely, TALIS and PISA belong to the same family of surveys.
And you can find out lots more about all those products on the OECD website, of course. Just to let you know, there are links now in the chat. You'll be able to find them to the PISA website. Also, there's a brand new PISA in Focus, all about the upcoming PISA report on December 5th, which you can read about there. And also Andreas's slides from earlier on from his presentation are now in the chat as well for anyone who is interested in seeing them again or sharing them with someone else. We are almost out of time. So just one last question to you, Andreas, before some final remarks, I think. I just want to quickly ask you about trends. What have been the notable trends over the past few PISA cycles, and how have those trends influenced the OECD's approach to education policy and reform initiatives?
Yeah, I can't talk about this year's PISA results, but if you look broadly, actually, in many countries, education has not that much changed. We see, in fact, a growing gap between what our societies expect and what education delivers. It's a big concern. But as always, PISA provides some fascinating examples of countries that have bucked that trend and actually continue to see improvements between, the early days of PISA and the year 2018. And I think those countries always provide inspiration that actually educational improvement is possible, that social background, poverty is not destiny, that you can actually, moderate the impact of those disadvantages quite effectively. So there's no single global trend. There are some countries that, keep moving forward, and there are a few that fall behind. And for many, their results have been highly stable in a world that actually demands a lot more from people today than it did in the past.
Thanks for that. And I know I'm being a bit cheeky asking this because you just said, you can't talk about the results, and everyone understands that. They're not due out until December the 5th. But what are you anticipating about the results? Are you anticipating any big changes? And feel free just to say no comment.
Well, you know, we know what happened in those years. The one experience has been the pandemic and the disruptions of schools. And, you know, some countries that where students suffered very badly from long school closures, other countries that were much better at keeping schools open or maintaining educational provision. Some countries that are very rigid in their design that had a hard time adjusting to new circumstances. Other countries that, you know, are very, you know, frontline oriented, very resilient. These things probably, you know, are playing out in the results. In a way, PISA is never a surprise. The PISA results are actually quite predictable. When you know an education system, you can pretty much anticipate its outcomes of PISA. Technology as well. We know in the pandemic, technology became the lifeline for education. So education systems that were more familiar with this, more open to new ideas, new technologies, obviously, you know, had an easier play with this. And so don't expect so many surprises. You know, I think PISA is just showing us what we have done in education and with what success.
Okay. Thanks so much for that, Andreas. That is all we have time for. Thank you to Andreas Schleicher, the OECD's Director for Education and Skills. Do please look out for those PISA results. They're launched on Tuesday, December the 5th, so about 6 weeks or so from now. That launch will be broadcast live right across the world. You can watch it at OECD TV. There's lots of national launches taking place as well. And if you want to learn more about the PISA ahead of that launch, then you can join me for another webinar next week, next Tuesday, in fact, where we're going to be talking about PISA and its role in improving maths performance, where I'm going to be joined by Andreas again and some other excellent guests who I'm pretty sure will have far superior math skills to me. No surprises there. That webinar is happening at 1 o'clock Paris time next Tuesday. Check out the OECD Education social media feeds if you want to see the sign-up details for that webinar. But for now, thank you to all of you for sharing your questions and taking part in this discussion. It has been fascinating. We look forward to you either joining us on the webinar next Tuesday or for those PISA results on December 5th. Thank you again to Andreas and hope to see you all soon. All the best.